So welcome back. We're talking about the Gospels, and last time we talked about the four unique Gospels, and we put on the screen a number chart. Number one, Jesus himself is kind of like the historical Jesus, and number two was the oral tradition that that grew around Jesus in the immediate aftermath of Jesus's death and resurrection in the communities that were represented. So the immediate aftermath, what were the stories that were being circulated? Number three, what is the nature of the author or the redactor? How are they part of the process? And how do they put it together? So that's number three. And number four, the Gospels themselves. And what we looked at before was the fact that to get to Jesus himself, we have to sift through the materials. And so today, we want to begin with the gospel itself, this time Matthew, and take a look at the things that are important to Matthew's gospel. So if you have a text of Matthew, you want to get that text out. I'll probably put it on the screen here, but you want to have your own text out so that you can see what and mark what's interesting as we move through. Let's take a look at Matthew. Let's take a look at Matthew again. And as we do, let me remind you of a couple of ways that we approach the text. The term criticism. Isn't a term that, it's not a negative term. There are kinds of criticism that we use in order to determine how we hit the gospel material. So first one is textual criticism. We look at the text and try to establish what's the best, most reliable way to look at the text. I've gotten it a handful of times. Why do we prefer, or why does one group prefer the King James Bible? Why do they say that's the only one? My only response to that is, I have no idea. I can't for the life of me figure out why someone would privilege the King James as a translation when the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic texts are what we use when we translate into English. And of course, the King James Version was a translation from the Vulgate. And Erasmus and those who are working on the King James Bible and in what led up to it, the scholars and what led up to it, of course, they were doing the very best that they could do. Now the texts are much better. When we talk about text criticism, I kind of get a big a tabletop with a puzzle on it, and you have to kind of set the pieces up and figure out how it all goes together. And that's kind of the way textual criticism is if those pieces are all Greek text and you're trying to figure out the best way to organize them so that they present the most authentic and ancient text. There are other kinds of criticism where the Gospels are concerned, and if you ever move to the next level of study, you may be interested in learning more about form criticism, how the texts of the New Testament may represent some of the forms that the ancient church used, and source criticism, and we're going to talk source criticism in a few sessions from now. But I want to just tell you, because it's easier to grasp, narrative criticism. That is, what does the text say? How does it say it? Who are the characters? What is the situation of the document? How does the document take that situation seriously? Matthew purports to be somewhat of an historical source. And so we read it from that point of view, but it's also, in as much as it's a story that's unfolded in space and time, it also makes some very particular faith claims as well. So there are three settings for the gospel narratives. And so Matthew's we've looked at Mark in depth previously, but just to set this up, settings of Jesus himself and the disciples themselves, that's important to the gospel writer. That is the first century in Judea, in Galilee, and in that region. The second setting is the setting for the community. So that is, where is Matthew or Luke? What community is important to the author? And then the setting in life for us as readers, where we are and how we discover the text, or maybe the better way, the more theologically accurate way, how does the text discover who we are in our setting? Those are three settings. We're going to look as much as we can to number one and number two, and then let number three kind of emerge for us as we move through the Gospels. Now, recently, Papias, the church father Papias, has recorded about Matthew and how perhaps he had an Aramaic gospel source that was then translated, and this has come under fire recently. And if you look at gospel parallels, and if you look at apocryphal gospels, it's interesting. I don't know enough, and I haven't done enough work to really put it into a small little segment like this. But it's interesting to note that so far I can discover Matthew has been the gospel most copied and like used in different apocryphal gospels. It's a very interesting thing. I don't know what to make of it yet, but it's an interesting thing. You can learn about that if you consult the Apocrypha of the New Testament. And to do that, it's very simple. You go to archive.org and you look up the New Testament Apocrypha, and the 2 volumes are in PDF form. It's amazing what you can get, especially old-time kind of stuff that's still relevant for gospel study. And so the sources of Matthew's gospel, these pieces or logia that Matthew may use, and we're going to talk about the sources after we discover and look at the unique features of each gospel. We've already looked at Mark, and perhaps I'll do a whole thing on Mark on its own just for to catch up. But the sources for Matthew, of course, the Gospel of Mark, and then something called Q, which is a sayings source. Now, here are I'm going to show you on this with this little piece right here what the saying source would be. So while we've never, Q is an abbreviation for the German word Quelle, Quelle, and as a source, it's hypothetical, and we only uncover it by doing literary archaeology. And so here we have some literary archaeology. You are the salt of the earth. Salt is good. If the salt lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? If salt lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? So this little phrase here, if the salt has lost its taste, how can saltiness be restored? This is a piece that these 2, Matthew and Luke, have in common that don't appear in Mark. Scholars will regularly attribute the dependence of Matthew and Luke on this other source as Q. And so somehow or other, Matthew has access to this, as does Luke. Okay, so some thoughts on the structure of Matthew's gospel. If you read chapters 1 through 28, you're going to get a sense of the structure of Matthew. He has 5 discourses, and each of these discourses are unique and has a certain kind of an accent to it. So the first discourse is the Sermon on the Mount. And we looked at the Sermon on the Mount just for a little. And so let's take a look at the Sermon on the Mount in more of a detailed way. Not completely detailed, but just to go over it. I would encourage you to go ahead and read it for yourselves to make sure you have the content. But it starts off with the Beatitudes. These series of blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed, blessed, blessed. And it shifts to the law and the prophets. And then a series of teachings, all of which begin in this way. You have heard that it was said. Right? Notice what is said to. You have heard that it was said, whoever murders shall be liable to judgment, but I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. Okay? And then, so each time Jesus has a chance, he strengthens the challenge. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Notice, ladies, you can lust all you want. Here it is again. It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, again, you have heard that it was said, you shall not swear falsely. But I say to you, nothing at all. Do not swear at all. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So you have heard that was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then we have this stuff on piety and almsgiving, prayer, with the Lord's Prayer. Well, let's take the Lord's Prayer in just a second. In chapter 5, what Matthew is doing is accenting the character of Moses by Jesus going up to the mountain and by beginning in this way, these auspicious blessings, configured as it is with these, they look like the Ten Commandments, but instead they're Beatitudes, followed by this series of teachings, you have heard that it was said. Each time Jesus accents one of the Moses teachings, and then he strengthens its character and even deigns to interpret it in its situation. So Jesus is cast by Matthew. Therefore, for Matthew's community would resonate with this kind of Jesus as Moses, or Jesus more than Moses moment. That's a really important point. And each time Jesus strengthens the teaching. You have heard that it was said, and then, but I say to you. This is Matthew casting Jesus as much more than Moses. And then we get into, now who would, before I move forward, who would that resonate with? That would resonate, you see, with a group of folks who esteem Moses. So we're talking about Jews here. People who were in Judea would resonate with this teaching. Now look at chapter 6. Beware of practicing your piety. And then concerning prayer, pray in secret. Pray in secret. Our Father, look at how Jesus teaches them. Pray in this way, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites. And then here's, do not lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Serving two masters, this is not a situation where you can do that. A statement about worry and anxiety, followed by judgment. Do not judge so that you may not be judged. And then what does Jesus do? Proceeds to judge. Jesus, as the only one who's qualified to make judgments, ask and it will be given to you. Search and you will find. Knock, the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who searches finds. And then look at the golden rule here. One of these teachings that is replicated all over the ancient world in philosophical traditions, from the Buddha to the Greek philosophers, to everything, do to others, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. That is, it's all here if you practice these kinds of things. Enter into the narrow gate. And then something very tangible, how Jesus accents this, you'll know the tree by its fruit. So the Sermon on the Mount is the first discourse, teaching discourse, followed by the mission directives to the 12. Each of these extended discourses, you can find broken up by other materials. And so look at chapter 8 and notice that there are these episodes in between where there are healings and there's little interaction. Here's Jesus stilling the storm, the Gerasene demoniac. So these things from Mark's gospel are woven in, and then all of a sudden in chapter 10, what do you find in chapter 10? Here are a few verses to associate with this, both from Matthew and Luke, and then the mission from the 12. So chapter 10 is where you get your apostle list and then their mission. Look at the extended red letters. That's what I mean by these discourses. Lots of Jesus speaking, as opposed to earlier in the gospel. See where it's more narration and Jesus' speech recorded. Here it's the teaching of Jesus in this way. So that's we got 3 more to go, and I'm going to start with these 3 and move on from there in the next video.